So this video is about, you're not doing a swap, but you want to buy a car or a truck that's already LS swap. So there's some things you really need to take a look at. In this video, that's exactly what we're going to cover. All right guys, there's some things that you really have to pay attention to. They're super important, especially because some of the swaps are done super well and some swaps, well, let's just say they could be a little janky, right? Well, you know that. All right, the first thing I'm going to tell you about is, now this might be a little controversial because typically if you're doing a swap and you have some fabrication skills, you can really save some money. And I'm talking about the transmission cross member, the setback plates or the engine mount, and all those different things. There can be some fabrication that you can do, and it's wonderful. If you can do the fabrication, you will save some money. When you're buying an LS car or a truck already done, I don't know. That's a little bit of a risk there. Hang with me guys, here's kind of where I'm going with this. When you buy swap parts that are off the shelf for vehicles, for the most part, they're engineered for that car, right? And so you can be sure that it's probably a proven design. You can probably find guys on forums and social media that have already used those parts. It's one of those things that's proven, right? Now, my only warning here is, for example, if someone fabs up the engine mount basically all the way, right? Or the cross member, those things can make the engine set completely different than they probably should be. So careful measurements and all those things can affect how the engine sits in the cradle, right? Even the cross member, if that's mounted incorrectly, you could be thrown off the angle, but also you can make the engine tip up and down underneath the hood as well. That's why I kind of just mentioned, take a look. You want to take a look at the engine mounts, the setback plates, what's used. Are they like ICT billet? Are they some of the parts that's used off the shelf? The second thing that I want to talk about, guys, is making sure that you check out how the car was built in terms of the combination, right? LS swap gets thrown around a lot. And one of those things that you really need to pay attention to, how matched up those parts are. And here's what I mean by that. Well, you could have an engine that's, 600-700 horsepower, right? But they got a stock LS7 clutch in it. And that clutch is not going to hold up, right? If you start, dumping the clutch and that sort of thing, really putting it through its paces above 600 horsepower, you're going to need a twin disc clutch, at least. Automatic transmission for L60 is probably not going to be, too performant up to a certain level. You want a 4L80E or something like that. My point really is just figure out how the car's set up. And then of course you got the rear end. The rear end, it's all sort of like there's a weak link there, right? So the rear end should be able to support that power. If you look under the car and it's got a 10 bolt, right? And it's all stock, you could have a problem with a high horsepower LS power plant. Okay, now if it's just a 5.3 or 4.8 and it's pretty much stock and they threw it in there out of the junkyard, you're probably okay, right? But you start putting boost on it, start doing all these different things to it, you need to start matching the power. Another one of those areas is ask the owner about the fuel pump and the injectors. That's things that you can't see very well. The injectors you could probably tell if you took a close look at it, but the fuel pump you're not going to know. It's all about matching that horsepower for that car. And then when you buy it, you have to think about, are you going to buy it and just leave it the way it is? Or are you going to, put some more things on it to increase that power? So just something to think about. And then obviously the drive shaft, U-joints, all those sort of things is another thing. So all those different parts really have to be matched. And if you go up in power, you got to match it all the way to the back. All right, guys, the next piece we're going to talk about for you, something to check out on your LS swap car, truck that you're getting ready to purchase. One of the things that a lot of guys are scared of is wiring, right? And you do have to do some wiring in an LS swap. Now, there's a lot of harnesses out there that are basically plug and play, which is great, but they do cost a lot of money, right? The Holley Terminator, the LS controller kit, PSI conversion, current performance, all those are great LS swap harnesses, right? And they're pretty much plug and play. Some of them, obviously there's an output where you have to, you still have to hook up your fuel pump. You're gonna have to hook up your fans, right? You're gonna have to hook up your dash. Those are the type of things that when you're doing an LS swap, you're still gonna have to wire in. So here's the tip that I have for you. Take a look at how they're doing some of those wire connections. You can go in and look at things like, the fan and how it's wired up. Just kind of look at the fan and trace it back to kind of see the connectors, that sort of thing. If they're running house wire nuts, then you need to run away. If you see house wire nuts, don't buy that car, guys. I'm sorry, don't do it. But all I'm saying is just take a look at that. You'll be able to see, and that'll give you some indication of the level of swap that person did when they worked on it. But one thing on the fuel pump relay, on an EFI LS swap car, one thing that you can do also, and this is another thing that I've seen guys do, is they basically run the fuel pump right on the key on, which you just don't want to do that, right? Okay, that thing should be controlled by the ECM, and it should only run for a few seconds, right? And then shut itself off. All it really is supposed to do when you turn the key on is really prime. When you're buying a vehicle, and especially, there's a lot of trucks out there already swapped. OBS is super hot right now, right? And so you just want to take a look at it, guys, okay? All right, guys, the next thing is really about, hey, man, you're putting some more power to the car. Maybe you're buying a car that's twin turbo, right? E85. It's super hot, man. And so you're looking for this car that's already done, ready to hit the street, ready to hit the track, whatever the case is. You're gonna wanna make sure power is matched. And if you're dealing with a vehicle, whether a car or truck that's known to flex under some big power, make sure they're running subframe connectors or something, reinforced frame, unibody to reduce that flex. Obviously this car came with a 305 TPI, right? And so the power levels then was way down. And being a T-top car, obviously that's one of my big concerns here is I need to make sure I've got some good weld-in subframe connectors. Some guys do the strut sort of brace here, which I think is a great idea. I wish I could find one to kind of go around the blower lid here. Just whatever you could do, reinforce, maybe you even need to run a 6-point cage or some type of cage, right? And so just make sure that that's sort of taken care of as well. And go ahead and drive the car, drive the car and see if there's any kind of driveline rattles and vibrations, that sort of thing as well. So you'll be able to tell, but a lot of time cars, especially cars, you can go back here and just make sure nothing's kind of twisted or popped, because this is kind of the area that you'll see something happen, right? Another area is gauges can be complicated. They can be difficult, especially the stock gauges, right? So on my car, on the 85 IROC Z, when I put the LS3 in it, I made sure that I really wanted the stock gauges. Now, if you go to a car and it's got autometer or some type of aftermarket gauges, that's pretty much a no-brainer. That's fine. But maybe they just, stock gauges on some vehicles just aren't that reliable. I get it. And they go with something like autometer, speed HUD, whatever. Let's talk about kind of the first one, and that's going to be the speedometer. A lot of times the speedometer is going to be cable driven. If it's VSS, it's actually going to be, so you're just going to make sure that, your speedometer and all that is done correctly, and make sure that it works when you test drive it. Get out your phone app, turn on a GPS app, and it'll be able to show you the speed, and just make sure that the speedometer is working. Some guys use GPS driven modules. Some guys use, if your car comes with a VSS or electronic, you're in good shape, but you still may need a module to kind of dial it in, or do it through the tune. That's possible too. And then also some guys are doing, cable, right? So if it's cable, you're going to have a cable box that's mounted somewhere in here, and then that kind of converts it to the VSS. That might be one thing that you ask the owner as well, is the speedometer, how it's driven. Is it VSS? Is it cable converted? Sometimes those boxes, depending on where they're mounted and things like that, that's just another piece that you may have to maintain in the future, but it's necessary if you want to keep the stock gauge. You need to check that speedometer and figure out what's driving that.
The next thing that I wanted to talk about is going to be the tachometer, right? And so the tachometer is going to be one of those tricky things because the signal, based on a 4-cylinder, 6-cylinder, 8-cylinder, there's all kinds of different settings here, guys. A lot of guys will do like a 12-volt sort of connection into the tach wire with a resistor between the 12-volt circuit and tying it into the tach wire, right? And so that just kind of gives it a little bit of a bump in terms of a signal. And so a lot of guys, they swap the car, they hook up the tachometer, and it just sits there when they start it up. So that's what they call a pull-up resistor. And what a simpler, and what, I originally did a pull-up sensor, but it wasn't very adjustable. So I ended up buying a Dakota Digital, and I ended up mounting it in here, Dakota Digital box. And that was an old one, so it has pins or DIN switches. Now they have little knobs, you can really dial those things in. So that's kind of the tach, guys. And just make sure you ask them, like, where's the modules located? Is it under the dash? Is it behind the seat? Where is it? So that's one thing to think about. And then, of course, your gas gauge is probably going to work just like it is. And then the temperature is going to be, that's typical a sensor that's on inside your head. And so that's going to be, in your motor. Basically 3 wire typically. One can run directly here. So the other 2 would typically run, to the ECM, wherever you have that mounted. So that's typically how that works, but that's an easy one to check to see if it's, working or not. Your battery or your volt, this just works out of the box. There's really nothing they really had to do in terms of the conversion for the most part. So that's something you don't really have to worry about, guys. Then the oil pressure, on mine, it's a single wire LS1 oil pressure sensor that I'm using. And that's just a single wire that runs right to the gauge. Unfortunately, the ECM doesn't see the oil pressure. So I know some guys have kind of done a split from where they mount the sensor and done 2, one going off. So there's different things like that, but I don't know, maybe the Holley Terminator kind of makes all that stuff easier now. But I'm just kind of speaking experience from sort of the stock ECMs and how to get that thing wired. Now, just speaking while we're in the interior, there's other things. Your transmission, basically your transmission, you have to wire. If you're doing a manual transmission or reverse lockout, that goes to a pinout on the ECM. And that's just so that if you're under a certain RPM, again, it's looking at the VSS signal to see how fast you're going. It'll actually engage a solenoid, and you can put it in reverse super easy there. So when you get in a manual car, make sure that it goes into gear super easy, right? If it doesn't, they probably don't have that hooked up.
The last thing about the gauge cluster, and this is the tricky one too, guys, is normally these LS swap ECMs, they have an output for the check engine light or the cell, okay? Make sure that works. When you turn on the key, now there may not be any codes, so you're not going to be able to tell, but if you turn the key on, if it's working in the dash, you should see it light up. If it's not lit up, that means they probably don't have it hooked up, which is a problem. That's another thing. You're going to have to pull the dash. You're going to have to track down where the ECM is, what pin out that is, right? And then wire it to the dash bulb, okay? Or the connector. So that's another thing to do there. And while we're talking about the ECM and sort of the interior there, another cool thing that you can do is bring with you, if you can go out there, and depending on your iPhone or Android, you'll have to look on let's say Amazon. You can buy an ODB2 reader and just download an app on your phone to be able to see. You could basically plug it in their car if the owner lets you, which, I mean, they're pretty familiar with that. That's how you tune it, the same sort of ODB2 port there. And normally it's accessible under the dash or something like that, so it's no big deal. So plug it in, and you can literally look at your phone, and it'll feed the telemetry data from the engine to your phone. You can check for things like, did they just clear codes, right? Or, all kinds of different things. All right, guys, the next thing is the engine. Now, you're gonna wanna go ahead and try to figure out which engine this is. So in this video, I'm not gonna go through that. You can certainly Google it, try to figure out if they claim, it's a 5.3 iron block, blah, 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 or it's a LS1 aluminum block. just make sure you check all your numbers, make sure everything sort of, fits what that is supposed to be and what they're advertising. So I'll do that in another video where I kind of compare different LS engines. It all depends, right? So this is the thing that I want to point out though in this. This is the thing that I want to point out in this video is the fact that, hey guys, let's just be real. There's some guys out there that go to a junkyard, they find a 5.3, 250,000 miles, they pull it out, they do the wiring, strip it all down, and throw it in the car, right? Now, that's fine. Like, it's very recyclable. It's very recycling, right? In that sort of manner. If it runs, it's fine. Hey, maybe they needed an engine and they just went ahead and did a LS swap. So just know that there's a whole, like LS swap is sort of bastardized in my opinion. Like there's all kinds of different levels of LS swap, right? You can have the LS swaps where they're going super cheap, which is cool. Like everybody has their budget and everybody has different goals. I don't fault any level of LS swap, right? I love small block Chevys. I love it all. So it's just, my point here is just know what you're getting into, right? Is it going to be a brand new sort of crate motor, all new LS3, LS7, 420, whatever that engine is, that's kind of the level you want and expect. Make sure you check that when you get to the car, right? Because there's a lot of junkyard swaps out there where they don't do shit to the car. They don't even change, probably the gaskets or anything. They take it as is and just put it right into the car. And they're just like bing, bang, boom. They're just done, right? You just need to be aware of in terms of getting into the swap and the level that the swap was done and how much you're paying for it is really the key thing that I want you to take away here, guys. All right, guys, the last thing that I want to cover is about exhaust. And so there's going to be custom exhaust. Some cars and trucks, they have kits that are pre-built for an LS, like Holley actually makes some for, F-bodies and things like that. That's full bolt-on headers all the way to the tailpipes, which is awesome, right? Otherwise, they're going to be custom. So just make sure you check those out. There could be some clearance problems. All right, guys. Well, subscribe to the channel if you find this content helpful. That'll let the master interweb universe of the world know that we're making some LS content as well. So that will be super helpful. Subscribe to the channel, hit that little bell so you're notified when the next video is coming out. I got some really cool ones coming up around LS swaps as well. So hope you guys get some helpful tips when you're going out and buying an LS swap car or truck.